Just checking if we are live. Yes, we are. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Caravan. My name is Ishan Sharma, and today we are here to discuss a book called Nehru and the Spirit of India, written by Manash, Firaq, Bhattacharjee, who is with us, the author of the book, published by Penguin. And I think over the last few years, since some people started uh, demonizing maybe the first prime minister of independent India, there has been a whole wave of literature on Nehru. And I myself have read three different narratives of Nehru in the last 1 year itself, published by Penguin, HarperCollins, and other publishers. So it's interesting to see how, in the 75th year of our independence, we are kind of, Nehru comes back to life more than ever, maybe more than when he was alive physically with us in the 60s. And people are openly praising Nehru, vilifying Nehru, critically analyzing Nehru. And this take, I think, Manash or Manash, as we were discussing the pronunciation, sorry, his take is rather uh, critical analysis, and compared to other published pieces. So that's my short review of the book. But Nehru remains an interesting figure of our democracy, of our history. And to discuss this book, I have a person who we all admire and we all look up to, Professor Apoorvanand, joining us from Delhi. He is a professor of Hindi at Department of Hindi, University of Delhi, and he is a voice, a very prominent voice against communalization, rising communalization. He writes very openly, he speaks openly. So he's going to be in conversation with the author, Manash Firaq Bhattacharjee, who is a wonderful writer. He has written a couple of books. I'll just name a few. The Town Slowly Empathies on Life and Culture during lockdown, that came out last year. Looking for the Nation Towards Another Idea of India came out in 2018, and Ghalib's Tomb and Other Poetry as a poems in 2013. He has taught lyric poetry and literary journalism in Ambedkar University, Delhi. So, without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Apoorvanand to take over from here. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to moderate the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Ashan. Thank you, Karwan, for organizing this conversation. And thank you, Manash, again for agreeing to be part of discussion on your book, Nehru and the Spirit of India. We will keep this conversation bilingual, and given the limitation that we operate in, since I don't know other languages, I know Bangla perfunctorily, but I know Hindi because I have grown up in an area which is mistakenly called Hindi speaking area. There are other languages than Hindi and older languages in this Khadi Boli Hindi will be using off and on in this conversation. So this conversation will be bilingual in Hindi and English, and it has nothing to do with the primacy of Hindi over other languages or Hindi nationalism, so to say. It's only to do with my own limitations. So thank you again, Ahsan, and it's a great initiative, Karwan. I've been observing it, and as you rightly say, and let me put it this way at the very outset, that the book that we are going to discuss, Nehru and the Spirit of India, is not a laudatory book. It's not a response to attacks on Nehru that the critics of Nehru or detractors of Nehru have been making on for last 8 years or even for last 40 years or 50 years or so. This is not a response to them, not a defense of Nehru, but it's an engagement with Nehru, with a person who is a poet and who is a political theorist, who is interested in ideas, and who is very much concerned about the direction that his beloved country is taking. So this book is informed his own personal journey and his, as I said, his engagement with ideas. And so Nehru, I would say, remains a reference point. And his engagement is interesting because it's a very critical engagement with Nehru. He differs with Nehru, he disagrees with Nehru. He never treats Nehru as an idol. And this is, I would say, the Nehruvian way to approach things or approach persons, because Nehru, I was reading his dialogue with Attenborough, Richard Attenborough, who, as a young man, after conceiving Gandhi, which he ultimately made in early 80s, his film, he had come to interview Nehru to talk about Gandhi. And Nehru told him that don't treat Gandhi as God. Treat Gandhi as a human being. Treat Gandhi as a human being. Portray Gandhi as a human being in your film. And that is what Manash does in his book, Nehru and the Spirit of India. But let me start with this cliched question, Manash. You are a young political theorist. There are so many things to write about. Why do you write about Nehru, or why do you engage with Nehru at this juncture in your life and at this juncture in the journey of India or world? It's a cliched question, but let's start with this question.
Thank you very, very much, Apoorvanand, for joining this discussion. I would first of all like to thank Karwa for initiating and facilitating this conversation. And in particular, thanks to Ishan for a great conversation we had sitting at Perch, and then from there we took this idea on, and today we are here sharing this platform, and it's really wonderful to be here. And also many thanks to everyone who has taken time to join this discussion. To come to your what you call your cliched question, which is not cliched, because this is just the beginning of this new journey that I've undertaken since the time I conceived of this book and I wrote it, and now that it's out in the world and it's getting responses from people. So in a way, as I have said before, that that my association with Nehru, there are like many origins, many starting points to this engagement. One is, of course, what I mentioned in the beginning of the book, which has to do with my childhood, my boyhood, where I'm getting to know of Nehru at home from my father and from people who come home. And then there is a Nehru which I'm coming to know from the school textbooks, which the teachers are teaching us at school. And I go through all of that, and then we have television coming in Assam. And I remember in 1998, there was the serial Bharati Khoj by Benegal, and that image of Nehru, Roshan Seth playing Nehru and narrating history from the ruins also had a very lovely impact in my mind on the figure of Nehru. And then, of course, I come many years later to JNU and we do a course on Indian nationalism, where I finally read The Discovery of India. And I am, I think, taken in so much by the text that I finally decide to work on Nehru for my MPhil, and then in my PhD, where I contrast and compare Nehru with Gandhi. But then I did not really go into Nehru after a certain period. I got interested in other issues, in other thinkers. But recently, not far back, I thought I must really bring back my old old engagement with Nehru, and I need to bring it out in the public realm, and to also rethink about Nehru. So all of this was in my mind, and I thought I should write this book, because suddenly in the public sphere there were all sorts of things being said about Nehru, which was also then leading many opinion makers, if I may say, in the media, also scholars, who have written books of late, that a certain kind of Nehru was increasingly being written about. And I also think back on the things I discovered of Nehru during my MPhil and PhD while reading about him. And then when I decided to go back to Nehru in order to contribute my thoughts on Nehru, I realized that a lot of my older views had changed, and there was more complex issues that I wanted to bring in, and that was great, because all PhDs beyond a point tend to get outdated. All of it doesn't stay the way it's written. And so I did not really, recreate my earlier work on Nehru. But this is a very fresh work with very fresh thinking or rethinking on Nehru, keeping, of course, the present, very, very popular reception of Nehru in mind, and also keeping some of the older concerns in mind, because a lot of things that we have seen and heard being told about Nehru in the media, in the public sphere, is actually not that new, because I'd heard some of this stuff from even my father when I was growing up. So a lot of this thinking, I think, has traveled since long. We may not have always heard them while growing up, but today it is all out there, and it is floating in the marketplace of the media. And I thought that I should grapple with Nehru, not in direct sort of conversation with all of the banal or superficial stuff that is happening around Nehru, but also to go deeper into what even the lot of serious work that has happened on Nehru, my agreements and disagreements with that work, and all of that. That was also part of my preoccupation, as much as dealing with some of the political concerns. I thought was more necessary to highlight than others in relation to the present context. So all of that actually went into the writing and the thinking of this book, where I wanted to, on the one hand, not only address Nehru, the political leader, because that is important, because as a political leader, Nehru, Nehru has had an impact on people's lives, and so his decisions and policies matter. But I was also very sure that I wanted to really bring back Nehru, the thinker, and the intellectual in Nehru, because often we tend to ignore our own political thinkers in favor of the West, which is something that has even happened for a long time in our scholarly practices. And also generally, we only tend to look at our political thinkers as people doing politics, but then we have had a unique, band of political thinkers who have also, intellectually grappled with all the great issues of modernity, as well as they have done politics, and often their ideas, unlike the professional philosophers and thinkers of the West, they have actually come out with these ideas from the real field of politics. So these were very unique sort of political thinkers that we have had in our country, and I thought that political aspect of what these people were doing intellectually should also be brought into the fore, particularly in these very anti-intellectual times where thinking itself is supposed to be a problem.
Thank you, Manash, for that. There are people who say that, well, yes, Nehru was a man of ideas, but he was not an original thinker at all. Gandhi is original, but Nehru is not original. What do you think about it? Because you called Nehru a thinker.
Yes.
And in this book, you also make a difference between thinking and knowledge.
Yes.
You say that the act of thinking is more important than knowledge.
Okay. Yes.
Again, you can go back to Kant and others, and
yeah.
So, and you call Nehru a thinker. So, what is original about his thinking? Or is it all imitation of Western thinking? Be it Weberian, at one point you call him Weberian. There are people who call him socialist. There are people who call him Marxist. Marxists don't regard him as Marxist. So, please enlighten us.
That's a very important and a very good question, Apoorva, that you have asked. And let me begin by, saying that this question you put in the, in the middle of your question on thinking and knowledge, and which is something that I mentioned in the very end when I'm giving this critique of Bhattacharjee's sort of critique of how the discovery of India sort of ends, and the later part of the book, and how Chatterjee is reading that part of Nehru's thinking, and my critique is based on this sort of affirmation of the question that Nehru raises in the end. And yes, you mentioned Kant, and there are others, and we know, for instance, from even a thinker like Martin Heidegger, who says that that the thinking or the question, that is the essence of being. And for me, I make the distinction between thinking and knowledge precisely in relation to the question. That knowledge is something which is apparently in many ways, produced by the answers we give to questions. But why I consider thinking to be more fundamental and more crucial than knowledge is because thinking is what raises the question. Thinking is what asks the question, and it is more in the essence of the question, where human thought sort of evolves, and the answers sort of keep changing. So that's why I mentioned the fundamentality, so to say, of thinking, because it is related to the question. And coming to Nehru from this perspective on the question, and then going into the originality bit that you asked. So as I mentioned in the very end of the book, when I'm talking about Nehru's relation with the question of history, I bring out this point that it is incredible, and perhaps I am not aware of any other book written, at least in the modern period, which is a political book, a book on history, a book of social criticism, and so many other things. A book which actually begins with a question, which is, that what is this India? And Nehru goes on to discover, so to say, India. And then he ends the book sort of asking the same question. So it is as if, having discovered India, he's still faced with the question of what is India. So the question that he begins with is the question that he ends with. The question never ends throughout the book. That gives a certain kind of speculative aspect of the book, which is really wonderful, because he's ultimately having the humility, and it is the humility of a man who's more fundamentally interested and serious about the question of thinking, and not just producing knowledge, that that whether he could discover India or not, or does this whole enterprise of writing the discovery of India finally mean anything? So what is that meaning of India that he was looking for? Was he able to really find it? So was he able to discover India? So in a way, it is probably partly an admittance of failure, that he's saying that he's failed to discover India, and he says that it was probably presumptuous of him to think that he can actually do this impossible job. So in a way, he admits to the question that this whole project of trying to discover India in his mind, through his thinking, by dwelling in Indian history and other questions, that he will be able to do this. So in a way, Nehru wanted to produce, say, in a way, the knowledge of India, what knowledge is, and yet he's being very sort of humble to admit a more fundamental sort of relationship with thinking, where he's ending with a question. So that itself, I think, makes Nehru and Nehru's project and Nehru's style of thinking very unique. And now to come to the question of origin or originality, so for me, I only understand the meaning of the word original only vis-a-vis something we can call the encounter. And this is something that I've mentioned in the book, in the sphere of cultural history, and we can come to that at some point. But for me, there is no, origin or no originality, or nothing original except the originality of the encounter. It is only the encounter that produces, the origin, or which is the myth of the origin, or the myth of what is original, or the myth of originality. So for me, actually, the word origin, original, originality is actually a myth unless it is explained through an encounter. And it is only that encounter which for me, produces the meaning of what we, understand as originality. And in Nehru's case, as much as in Gandhi's case or anybody's case, we see that it is an encounter with the West, as much as it is an encounter, within Indian history that produces these people, their thinking. And so in that sense, they are as original, each of them in their own way, as anybody else in the world. And it is actually, political in that very sense, that it is the encounter with colonialism as well as the encounter with Western modernity that produces Gandhi and Nehru. And so I don't think that, there is something less original in Nehru and more original in Gandhi. Yes, Gandhi, thought a lot outside the dominant strands of Enlightenment thinking, which was the sort of intellectual order of the day. So Gandhi should get credit for that. Whereas Nehru is seen more to be a pro-Enlightenment thinker, and a lot of scholars and intellectuals who have also had deep empathy and affinity with the Enlightenment, with scientific rationality. They have also seen Nehru in that fashion, and like I have said, and I believe that it is possible for any scholar or intellectual, to read Nehru predominantly through that lens of the Enlightenment, which is the scientific rationalist Nehru, which he is made out to be. But a deeper and closer look of Nehru's writings doesn't, give me that picture. I see that Nehru really grapples very much originally, if you may, with Enlightenment thinking, and yet he produces other sort of thinking, which is actually not very close or very much at ease with, pure enlightenment thought. And that thinking in Nehru, and which is where I think Nehru is most, if you may, original, is how he understands Indian history. I think Nehru is probably the most, original Indian thinker when it comes to grappling with the question of Indian history, the sort of long Indian history, and all of this is produced as in his Discovery of India and his other writings, where he really makes very interesting or original moves. And like Professor Aditya Mukherjee was saying the other day when we were having a conversation, he says that Nehru is somebody who actually is the precursor of the historians who come, decades after him, about how to deal with colonial periodization, how to break away from the colonial stranglehold of looking at Indian history and looking at it from, so to say, the inside. How do we look at our own history? So Nehru was one of the first people to break the shackles of that kind of lens. So a lot of originality there, I would say.
Yeah, so thank you for that response. And while you're speaking, the word origin kept coming back. And in fact, there is no origin to anything. And when Nehru describes India, Nehru doesn't care for the point of origin of India. He calls it a palimpsest of a manuscript, which is a very layered manuscript, where inscriptions from behind can lurk and be visible, and it's very difficult for you to differentiate very clearly two layers. So this negation of or this resistance to look for an origin is also, I think, something very special to Nehru, or Nehru's way of looking at things. He's more interested in, as you say, encounters, and that's why even Marxist historians or thinkers like Anderson and then thinkers like Bhattacharjee get confused, because what Nehru is trying to do is very different from professional historians or professional political theorists. And they try to look at him from the professional lens. So this is the discipline that we have evolved in, and this is the discipline. These are the boundaries of this discipline, and why does it Nehru not adhere to them? So that, I think, worries them. But while you were talking about history writing and you are written it, there are two things you talk about. One is subjectivity, and the other is question of ethics. So these two things are central to Nehru's writing and thinking. His subjectivity, his own subjectivity, and the question of ethics. What is good life? What is good? Or how should I live? These questions inform his what we call history writing or writing as such. So, would you like to elaborate on these issues?
That's an interesting question. It actually reminds me of, say, this is the very early part of the Discovery of India, where interestingly, when Nehru is actually is meditating briefly on the thinker, the Indian thinker Aurobindo, and he's actually also remembering what Aurobindo had talked about in relation to time, the question of time and what is time, and Nehru is suddenly thinking about the question of time, sitting in prison. And if I remember correctly, there is that small a section which is titled probably "Time in Prison," and in that section, he begins by bringing in Aurobindo on the question of time, and then he goes on to talk about time in relation to being in prison, but also vis-a-vis the larger question of time in politics. And he has a very interesting phrase, if I remember, the psychological moment of action. So he's saying that somehow everything, like, all thinking, all knowledge, somewhere has to finally produce or has to somewhere inform the psychological moment of action. And that is not just, in Nehru's case, as we know, an existential question, a philosophical question. It is also a real question. It is a question of politics, because it is a question of action, and it is again a question of the encounter. That how do we, from all the things that we have learned and digested and accepted, rejected, how do we then finally, receive or be part of this encounter, which is politics as well, which is the political. So, so the encounter is not just a sort of philosophical predicament or question, it is also a political predicament, a political question. How do you face others? How do you measure this relationship? How do you look at this relationship? How is your action sort of informed by this, and what does it produce? So in Nehru's case, this question of life that you just said, is that how does one live life, good life, and I'm sure Nehru has had like varying sort of ideas about life itself from his university days, where as he says in his autobiography, that he was sort of very inspired by Nietzsche, and he was reading other writers, and there was a certain kind of Epicureanism also, where, which he was drawn to. So he was a mix of many things, and he was also in jail later, reading Tulsidas's Ramayana, reading a lot of old Indian classical texts. But to come back to this question of life and action, I would say that that somewhere it is interesting that Nehru is of course drawing us the idea of the reader, the idea of the intellectual, with the man of action, and precisely what I think we should need to look at Nehru as well, and that's what I've tried to do. That Nehru is not separately a man of action and separately a man of intellect, but what is most fascinating to, of course, see is where the two combine or they meet, or in fact there is an encounter within Nehru, so to say, of the intellectual Nehru and Nehru, the political leader, or the anti-colonial political activist, who is out there, and it is interesting also because here perhaps I would like to end by saying that we should be probably alert to this question, that there is obviously going to be a contradiction between the man of action and the man of thought. It is impossible that anybody can live out exactly a life which is a life of thinking. And that does not happen because we are there in the world, and the world itself produces these contradictions. The encounter is supposed to create, something where you're facing something new. So you cannot just act according to how you think. So that aspect is also important to keep in mind, because a lot of people often tend to sort of interpret such figures by saying, look, this is what he thought, this is what he wrote, but look, this is what he did. So and there's a big gap between the two. But I think that gap, of course, should be critically looked into. It should be critically analyzed, and yet I think that gap is inevitable.
Yeah. So this your response leads me to another question or another observation. If I'm not wrong, I'm simplifying it. But I think your companion on this journey is Octavio Paz. So you are traveling with Octavio Paz to understand Nehru, or to converse with Nehru, or to engage with Nehru. He remains with you throughout the book. And Octavio Paz describes him as a man of contradictions. You have talked about contradictions. Now, contradiction is a negative term. You have to be consistent. If we again refer to Walt Whitman and say that I'm multitude, so that's a different thing. But Nehru was no poet. He was not allowed to have that. If you are as generous as Hiren Mukherjee or people like him, who say that Nehru couldn't be a successful politician in that sense of the term because he was not that crude. And it requires a certain amount of crudity to succeed in politics. So that's what he said. But this thing of contradictions, can you explain it? Why does this description, you agree with this description? Why don't you think that is a negative thing?
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I mean, that question is pretty central to my book, and it sort of remains below the surface throughout the book in whatever I'm sort of trying to analyze, understand, discuss. The question of contradiction and my approach to the question of contradiction is pretty much there, and it's something that I established right in the beginning by quoting Octavio Paz, and it is very nice of you to observe, this affinity with Octavio Paz, about which I made no bones of you. I mean, I put it out there that yes, I take Octavio Paz's 1967 lecture on Nehru in Delhi very seriously. It is such a short, speech, but it is so full of depth and insight, and I thought Paz was actually catching on to some very, very interesting and important things about Nehru, which somehow has probably been often ignored by scholars. And for me, it is also nice and important that you took his name, because in a world of social sciences, we do have hierarchies in our mind, that how do we really take, for instance, a Mexican poet and his observation on an Indian thinker so seriously, or more seriously than probably some other political theorist or social scientist or whoever. And there are these multiple hierarchies that our disciplines often suffer from, whether it has to do between social science and non-social science, or whether it has to do with India and West. So it was really very pleasurable for me to make Octavio Paz so central, and to make Nehru as important as an intellectual thinker, for instance, than vis-a-vis say Western thinkers, put them at par, and all of them being treated at the same plane, which is the only plane they should belong to, right? I mean, there is no higher. You cannot really hierarchize the world and think of thinking in those terms. And now to come to the question of contradiction. Yes, I mean, Octavio Paz makes this very interesting observation that one of the greatness of Nehru is that he allows contradictions to remain without forcibly suppressing them, and he says that those leaders in the world who have sort of treated the question of contradiction with so much animosity, with that they felt that only way forward is to sort of brutally suppress these contradictions for the sake of a utopia. They have really done a lot of harm to human life, to human thinking as well, with so much of repression, so much of suppression of thought that we have all read in the long history of the 20th century. And Nehru was somebody who past says wasn't or cannot be compared to these sort of leaders, world leaders, precisely because he had the philosophical depth to understand that history's contradictions cannot be brutally suppressed, and we must grapple with this contradiction. It is not that these contradictions are not a problem. Contradictions do create problems, but the whole point is that if the fundamental nature of history is to produce contradictions, then the suppression of one contradiction is not going to grant you any sort of a utopia, even if you believe in a certain kind of a resolution of contradiction and then the production of new contradictions, and as if that is again a sort of way to be. But then the very idea that it must be violently, brutally, absolutely suppressed in order for something new and better, supposedly better to emerge. That itself has led to a lot of serious, problems in the world, and this of course comes from a certain kind of modernist thinking. This is at the heart of Enlightenment thinking. This is the heart of Hegel, Kant, Marx. That this is actually also a very rationalist approach and understanding of the idea of contradiction itself, which was very different in the case of Heraclitus. Heraclitus did not look at contradiction in the way the Enlightenment thinkers really thought about it. They had a very rationalist sort of approach to the question of contradiction, where the only way out is to find resolution by suppressing these contradictions. And what it actually plays out in the real political world, that is also a question, that is also the problem that I'm hinting at. And if we come there, we find that that in the case of Nehru, for instance, when Paz is granting and affirming the fact that that Nehru is somebody who was able to find his way through the contradictions of history without brutally suppressing them, also did not brutally suppress himself within, because our understanding of this kind of ethical thinking, which is very different from the rationalist, thinking, which is predominantly based on the Enlightenment, is and they leave out this very critical ethical aspect, which is that that we all have contradictions within us, and to suppress these contradictions brutally within us is also to lose part of ourselves for the sake of reinventing ourselves, or making ourselves in the image of something or someone that we think is going to be liberating, but often it is not. I mean, why is self-annihilation or part self-annihilation supposedly a great liberating a journey that the self must undergo? This is the sort of very, very brutal sort of modernist thinking that we have all at some point suffered from, and also this has also kept us from speaking to others. The big problem with ideological thinking is that we want to transform the world into our own image. We think that we hold the truth, and we want to convert the whole world into into that belief. But the whole point is that the world is different than us. The world thinks differently from us, and the whole point of the encounter and the engagement with other people is probably not to convert others into one's own thought, but to actually see where two thinkings, two thoughts take us, right? And to do this would also, mean that we fundamentally accept the contradicted. We fundamentally accept the person who contradicts us. And that in the largest frame of things in historical political frames would mean that we are not here to really brutally suppress all contradictions that are out there in the world. There are contradictions in social forces, there are contradictions of all kinds, but if you somewhere accept the fundamental heterogeneity of the world, and also the fact that social forces cannot be brutally suppressed into making something new out of them, then we become more humble, more cautious, more ethical towards our understanding of the world, where we are actually not treating contradiction as something to overcome, but something that we need to engage with, something which tells us of the very nature of life and of history.
Right. So Nehru, I would say, had this. Nehru always suffered from this dilemma, because was he a statesman or was he a politician? He had before him the business of creating a secular state. It was a very practical thing, and he had to soil his hands. So ideation is one thing, you can ideate, but when you get to translate your ideas into a reality, then troubles arise. There are times when you compromise, and if I myself regard Nehru as the last true Gandhian, in that sense, and Gandhi himself called himself a man of compromises. And Nehru also says this, that compromise is not a bad thing, and Nehru compromises many times. And then he's seen as a weak person by many people, by Marxists, by others, that is compromising. He delays actions. I was recently reading the debate on the first objective resolution. And the first objective resolution in the Constituent Assembly was proposed by Nehru. And Nehru wanted it to be adopted urgently, but it was postponed for weeks. And while concluding the debate, Nehru is given chance to speak on the resolution, and he says that, yes, there was a certain sense of urgency. I wanted it to be adopted immediately, but then we decided to wait for people to join, wait for people to think. So this whole idea of postponing, so Nehru postpones many decisions and is lambasted or criticized as an indecisive man. So he's an indecisive man, not fit to be prime minister of a country like India. How can you be indecisive and yet be prime minister? So this indecision, this tendency to compromise, postpone, and not force. So Nehru, as a politician, as prime minister, as driver of or creation of this state, secular state, he tries to accommodate opinions and views and create a consensus. He again says, and I find it very interesting, that we should try to create consensus and not take decisions in conflict, because decisions when taken in conflict lead to disaster, to bloodshed. So we should try to avoid that. In democracy, you call for division of votes, but Nehru is ready to walk, I would say, 100 miles to have a consensus on issues. So you have this discussion on Hindu Code Bill, and criticism of Hindu Code Bill that he betrayed Ambedkar Sahab and waited for it. So, yes. So if we now come to the more mundane thing of creation of state, or Nehru as one who is dealing with state business. And Nehru is considered to be a great secular man, praised and criticized for the same reason, that he is secular. I found your discussion of Nehru's secularism very interesting. Nehru is seen as a pro-Muslim person, pro-Muslim politician. But you do find out a contradiction in Nehru's approach toward the Muslim question. You say that Nehru welcomes Muslim culturally, but when it comes to their political rights, there's certain ambivalence in Nehru. And you discuss Nehru and Ambedkar together. Ambedkar has certain view of Muslims, and he says that Muslims, if they have to choose between Afghanistan and India, so it would be very difficult for them to choose between the two. But he bats for their rights as minorities. And when he discusses minorities, it's a large, all-encompassing term. And it doesn't have to do with numbers. It has to do with your political power. What political power you wield in democratic setup, which is based on elections, which is based on democracy, which is question of representation, etc. So, can you please talk a little bit more about this approach of Nehru towards Muslims and minority question?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, now we are for very good reasons discussing.
Let me ask Yashan, do you also take questions from the audience, or?
Yes, we take questions from the audience. As of now, I can't see any question, but those who are watching us right now, please feel free to drop in questions in the live chat.
So I think, Manash, we can do without this, and you should respond to the questions that are coming from the audience.
Okay. And but instead of waiting, maybe I can just try to say a few things on what you said, and then as questions come, maybe Ishan can tell us, and I can stop.
Is that fine, Ishan?
Yes, sir. Yes. That's
okay. Okay. So please go ahead.
So in short, Nehru, of course, yeah. I bring out this ambivalence in Nehru on the Muslim question, that how he absolutely places them at the heart of Indian civilization, India. Its cultural history and all of that. But when it comes to the more specific sort of immediate question of the present, when it has to do with political rights, then Nehru is circumspect about granting too many rights to Muslims as a community, and that is, of course, I think somewhere partly because of his apprehensions, which is post-partition, which comes from partition, and he's very sort of alert on the question of disunity, and so he's always sort of having this paranoia, which is actually again a double-edged one, because on the one hand, he's very clear that no majoritarian voice can be raised which can disturb the place or the confidence, the faith that the minority has in the country. But he's also on the other hand very alert and suspicious of too many sort of strong political rights being asked by the by the minorities. So he's sort of caught between these two concerns, and somewhere this makes the question of unity very central, which for me is actually the central problem here, because Nehru is somewhere letting the question of diversity work at a cultural level, but whereas the question of unity is political, and he thinks that any sort of question of rights by communities might disturb this unity. So this I think is a sort of a post-partition paranoia which Nehru had, and also looking at the idea of the nation very much from this idea of oneness, and whereas I argue in this book that we should probably think in terms of two-ness, and this two-ness has nothing to do with any sort of this two-nation theory business, because I don't endorse any sort of idea of that kind, because two-nation theory based on certain religious identity or some ethno-national sort of identity, that sort of argument is not about two-ness at all. It is also about oneness. It is also very majoritarian. So whereas that is a problem of a different kind, I would say that within a nation which accepts heterogeneity, accepts diversity, should work with the fundamental principle of two-ness, and by two I don't mean just two can be 3, 4, 5, saying that there are various people thinking of their political present, their political futures, and the questions that they face in the daily life from different perspectives, and the state should perhaps look at these concerns not from a sort of paranoid position, but from a much more open sort of position. Yeah. Do we have anything?
So, Ashkan, if there are questions, please. I do have many questions, but I think let's have questions from the audience.
As of now, I can't see any questions, though there are a few comments.
So can you read them? So please, if there are comment on what Manash was saying.
So there is a question I would just read out. It's up to the speakers to respond. But Rahil Bashir says, why has the critical discussion regarding Nehru's chauvinism and anti-democratic maneuvers vis-a-vis Kashmir elided the left liberal scholarship so far?
Let me tell you who is the person who has questioned.
Rahil Bashir.
Rahil, that Manash has dealt with this issue and critically. So Manash, would you please respond to this Kashmir question? Because this is again a chapter which, given the limitation of our time, we couldn't discuss. It required longer discussion. But Manash deals with this question, grapples with it, and is critical here. Am I wrong, Manas?
So absolutely right. Yes, I have gone into the Kashmir question through the question of the Nehru Abdullah relationship, and I have been told recently by a journalist from Kashmir that this question, the Abdullah Nehru friendship has not been really looked into since long. And I'm glad that I could do something about that aspect. And in my sort of reading of the friendship between Abdullah and Nehru, I have raised critical questions vis-a-vis how Nehru deals with Abdullah, and that is all. And though I may not have always spelled it out, but that relationship and how Nehru deals with Abdullah is also sort of part of how Nehru treats Kashmir. And it is the same vis-a-vis Abdullah, but it is also if I may add that Nehru and Abdullah were not really, having this political friendship by themselves in a vacuum. This relationship or this friendship was also happening around, many forces that were working around them and trying to destabilize the relationship between Abdullah and Nehru. And so those forces which were working around them is, are also, people I would take seriously and look at very critically. And I don't have a position where, of course, Nehru is all wrong or and that sort of a dismissal of Nehru. I would say that that Nehru did sort of try to forge this relationship, and it went unfortunately wrong in the middle, and Nehru is also responsible for what went wrong. But like I said, there were other forces working around them to destabilize that thing as well.
Thank you so much, Manash, and thank you so much, Professor Apoorvanand. We have run out of time, so thank you so much, Professor Apoorvanand, for moderating this session so well, and thank you so much, Manash, for answering these critical questions with which you are known as an erudite scholar and a writer, and you come across one when you write. And when we read this book, Nehru and the Spirit of India, I'll just show the cover once again for those who want to get it. It is available almost in all the bookstores now. And I think it's time to reevaluate our understanding of a historical figure like Nehru in times when people are pretending to be Nehru, but in a very different sense. They distance themselves from Nehru, but at the end they are like Nehru, grappling with the same tension, uh, with the same problems and issues that he might have faced in 1947 to 1960s when he was acting as the Prime Minister of India. And all said and done, I think Nehru remains one of the most interesting figures of our history. I won't say the greatest or the worst, but we can't be quantitative in history. So he remains an important figure nonetheless. So many congratulations, Manash, for writing this book. And we'll be doing another session on Nehru in December with Professor Purushottam Agrawal. So for those who want to join us again, and we'll be doing another offline session in February with Manash and other writers on Nehru to analyze Nehru in the 75th or the 76th year of independent India. Thank you so much to both our speakers for joining us today. We'll be back with another session on 15th December on it's by Professor Angana Chatterjee about violence, memory, and post-conflict. So do join us for that. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining in today. I'll just end the live here. We'll see each other on 15th December.